Alright, so now that I'm officially moved out, let's get back to this series because it's one I think will most benefit from a more frequent schedule. This is Albums I Haven't Heard, where I bring you 5 records I haven't heard yet with the intention to remedy that fact by next episode. After that, I bring back my homework from the previous one and give my thoughts on whatever records I mentioned before. Without further ado, let me get started with my 5 new picks. First off, I'm going to bring up one that I've been wanting to listen to for a very long time and thought this series would be the perfect way to get to talk about it, and that's the 1981 This Heat album titled Deceit. From what I've heard, this is one of the most out there and experimental albums of the early 80s, and also one of the darkest. I'm anticipating some really wild stuff, especially looking at this album cover, which is just horrifying. Looking at the images that this face is actually made up of, though, I'm also expecting something political and potentially apocalyptic lyrically. This is also supposed to be a more quote-unquote accessible record than their previous, but by the looks of things, it's more accessible probably in the same way that Shoo Shoo's albums got more accessible after A Promise, but it actually just made the records even more unnerving. I hope that I have a lot of thoughts on this one. Jumping forwards a handful of decades, despite being a pretty avid enjoyer of the band's stuff, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard's perceived opus has pretty much entirely evaded me. I know the gimmick, and I can call to mind the "Nonagon Infinity opens the door" refrain, but I've not actually listened to this. I'm anticipating something akin to the psychedelic garage rock of I'm in Your Mind fuzz, which, if that's the case, I have nothing to worry about because that's one of my favorite Giz albums. Does the album actually loop nicely? Does that gimmick work to the benefit or the detriment of the music itself? These are my main questions going in, and I should have the answers for you in a couple of weeks. After a certain older video of mine scared me off from the genre, I've been pretty reluctant to give full, in-depth thoughts on any black metal for a very long time. I'm looking to end that streak of silence now, though, as it remains to be one of my favorite genres of music, period. Because it's such a big part of my musical intake, though, I find it a bit embarrassing that I haven't given any thought or time to what is almost universally hailed as American black metal's greatest achievement, that being Dead as Dreams by Weakling. I know that these guys were a big influence on Wolves in the Throne Room, which is one of my favorite US black metal bands, so that's a big bonus. Aside from that, I'm pretty oblivious when it comes to this thing, and I'm happy to go in as blind as possible. This next one is a suggestion from my friend Joel, and also inspired by me hearing a song from it while my partner was watching The Bear and being like, damn, this is awesome. And that's Refused's The Shape of Punk to Come. Post-hardcore has long been one of my absolute favorite genres ever, and so it's a little weird for me to have just completely skipped out on what at least proclaims to be the blueprint for all music of its genre going forward. I'm not sure why I haven't bothered with this one yet, but the direct self-comparison between this and one of the most important and amazing jazz records of all time certainly didn't leave the best taste in my mouth on first blush. After the track I heard, though, I'm starting to think maybe there's something there. Let's hope that's the case. And finally, I come to you with what is likely my biggest music nerd blind spot, and that's the tragic fact that I have never listened to Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I have no excuse and very little to say about it. I just simply never seemed to demand my attention, and so it always sat by as one of those things I would get to when I get to it. Well, this is when I'm getting to it. I don't have any expectations or framework from which to build any kind of anticipation. I'm just going to go in and see what I find with what seems to be his most acclaimed release, Let Love In. Now for my reviews on last episode's albums, I want to start with probably the most out-of-place record of the video, and that's Bon Iver's For Emma Forever Ago. This is pretty much exactly as beautiful as I expected it to be, with very few surprises for me, but a very comforting sense of security. It's really incredible to me that this is their debut album because the niche that Bon Iver cultivates for themselves is so realized and so well defined right out of the gate. This is also the very first thing the band put out at all. No singles to test the water, no early demos or EPs, just boom, here's the album. For it to have turned out so great, and especially to have been so influential from that, is kind of astounding. You also probably caught that I called them a band, which I didn't do last time. I actually only just realized that Bon Iver isn't the name of the dude here, and there are many full-time members of the group. My bad. With all of that said, I'm very happy with this record. I don't have a ton to say about the content because I find it just washes over me most of the time without necessarily sticking to me in any particular way, but it puts me in a really good mood every time. Justin Vernon's vocals are incredibly soothing, be it in his regular falsetto or when he gets a little more in his chest about it, like on the banger Skinny Love. The last two tracks are also super worth shouting out. The first for how loud and exciting it is as a penultimate track, and the finale for its winding, almost spiritual structure that feels like just the perfect way to end things. This was a joy to discover on this series and set the tone nicely for the rest of the things to come. Now onto one of the many punk albums I listed last time. Let's stick to the mid-2000s with Bloc Party's debut record, Silent Alarm. This is probably the least, quote, essential record I've talked about in this series, but I found it no less enjoyable and excellent than the rest. Especially given its influence on a lot of the best modern rock and post-punk music, I think it's really fitting to be talking about them now of all times. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, I was about to see them perform live with Paramore, whose new record is the biggest example I would give of Bloc Party's influence, and not to dig on the band too much, but it was very, very, very funny seeing the shift in crowd energy anytime Bloc Party played anything that wasn't on Silent Alarm, because this really was a flash in the pan that will probably never be repeated. With that being said, wow, what a bright flash it was. Silent Alarm is one of those singular releases that defines the time it came out perfectly. Rock was going through a lot of revivalist movements at the time, with space rock's revival reaching the end of its peak and garage rock being all the rave at the time. Bloc Party was far from the first post-punk revival act, or even the first massively popular one, but I would struggle to find another record that so completely captures the dancier side of the genre. At times it reminded me of LCD Sound System with how groovy and invigorating it is, but with a lot more emphasis on jagged guitar lines that pierce through the crystal clean mix. That's what was most interesting to me about this record, the fact that it's so pristinely produced to the point where it feels sterile in a way that is actually subversive. Every detail is on perfect display on this thing, with almost no distortion getting in the way of anything. Kayle's vocals are the other most prominent thing, and they're mixed so high and are so unique that they practically grab you by the shoulders and demand you listen. I loved this record, and will probably still be returning to it fairly often. Now, throwing it back a few decades, I am so excited to talk about the De La Soul debut, 3 Feet High and Rising. If there's one thing I can say right out of the gate, it's that despite the reputation this record has for being dated, I actually find it to be super ahead of its time. Now, that doesn't mean I think it's modern or anything. It definitely is dated, but is this thing dated all the way back to the 80s? In my opinion, not a chance. The production and beat crafting on this thing is at the very least worthy of like 1994, if not even further ahead. I can also see why this had such a hard time getting reissued in any capacity, because the samples used are of such popular songs and they are so prominently used. I think that the expert flipping job is a massive part of what makes this record's vibe so unique. And I mean it when I say that this is a unique vibe. I honestly don't think I can think of any other record which sounds like this. It's so wholly standalone, and I don't even know if I've ever heard anyone even attempt what was done here in the decades since, because it's just so untouchable. From what I hear, De La Soul themselves never attempted to do another record like this, instead getting way darker, which I'm super excited to hear. For this album, they've gone totally psychedelic and colorful, which you can pretty easily tell just by looking at the cover. This is also one of the more family-friendly records in the genre by a lot. Very minimal explicit language and content, minus De La Orgy, which makes me want to deduct a whole point for just inventing the sex skit and cursing us with some of the worst moments in rap history, even if this one isn't the worst offender. But aside from that, it's all blissed out positivity from front to back. Songs about self-love and confidence rarely ever need to bring anyone else down to raise themselves up. Instead, this is a record that truly feels uplifting and universal. The three MCs here are all equally talented, and while the rapping style is technically rudimentary, there's personality and distinct character to each one, and the way they bounce off each other, especially in the skits, which are some of my favorite in the genre, it's truly something special. I'm very happy I got to talk about this album on the channel because it's one I'll be returning to far more than most for its one-of-a-kind sound and personality. Staying in 1999, but shifting focus to my home country of Canada, NoMeansNo have very quickly become the artist I'm most excited to dive further into from this list after hearing their most acclaimed record, Wrong. This is one of those albums that I have such an easy time listening to and loving. To my ears, it all makes sense, but once I try and put it to words, I come up short. Part of that is, I think, because so much of musical discussion and critique is tied to comparisons and context, but with this, nothing I try to compare it to quite feels sufficient. I saw a really good comment on this album that it could have come out 20 years earlier or 20 years later. It's just so ubiquitous in its sound, like the total convergence of punk music's vast history in one 40-minute package. It's violent, political, funny, groovy, sloppy, precise, and all kinds of other adjectives that should be mutually exclusive, but somehow this record combines all of it seamlessly and so much more. The first instinctual comparison I make with this record is Dead Kennedys. I mean, this is one of the only records I can think of that comes close to emulating East Bay Ray's surf punk tendencies while still maintaining their own unique take on it. Rob Wright's lead vocals on here also at times remind me of Jello's in their sheer mania and speed of delivery, but I think Rob brings it to a new high even beyond that of Dead Kennedy's peak. The other major comparison I see, though, is to the very roots of punk in UK acts like The Clash and Crass, in particular with how incredibly vital the bass guitar is to this sound. The bass is what drove a lot of the shifts from punk to post-punk in the UK, so it makes a ton of sense to me that in these earlier years of post-hardcore, it would also be one of those driving elements of change. Beyond that, there's the noise rock influence in the buzzsaw guitar tones, and even bits of prog and jazz in the drum patterns and performances, but cranked to 11 in intensity. There's so much more I can say with this record, but none of it would be cohesive, and I think that's one of the things that made me love this record so much. It's so multifaceted, more than most music I've ever listened to, but it's also so perfectly constructed that in trying to describe it, the real magic reveals itself in just how impossible of a task that is. This is a strong contender for my favorite punk album of all time, and I'm beyond ecstatic to see what else this band has to offer in their back catalog. And finally, keeping to the topic of punk and even UK post-punk, I was definitely a bit misled when I said last time that Wire's Pink Flag was going to be all that post-punk at all. This is a pure, raw UK punk band, at least in this iteration. If anything, there's a bit more of like an artsy, proggy bent to this one. Something that I haven't really talked about on this channel is my opinions on UK punk in general, and that's because, to my shame, I have never really loved it all that much, and I can't really seem to figure out why. I always disliked the Sex Pistols, found them obnoxious and overly pristine, and while I've always loved The Clash in theory and found their story really interesting, the actual music has never quite grabbed me in the way that I've always felt like it was supposed to. It was something about the use of pop structures while still denying that it was making accessible music to me, whereas the American punk I love most is raw, aggressive, and uncompromising for the most part. American punk was hardcore in a way that I just didn't quite see with UK punk. Pink Flag is hardcore. It's not even necessarily hardcore in its aggression. I can think of a dozen bands right now that go harder than this, but in its ethos and its speed, this is hardcore. Seriously, if you look at this track list, it looks like a Discordance Axis album or something. There's barely a song that breaks 2.5 minutes, and a decent handful of these 21 tracks don't even crack 60 seconds. That grindcore-like commitment to small ideas feels, rather than lazy or like they didn't have enough creativity to build, instead like they spent hours in the editing room on each of these, paring them down to the exact length that they needed to be with not a single second of fluff. If the song needed to be 3 minutes, like the opening track, then that's what they did. But if there was only like 40 seconds necessary to get the point across, then why would you waste anyone's time? This core idea for the record leads to easily one of the best flowing records I've ever heard. The pacing on this thing is just incredible, and the music itself is no slouch either, with those snotty, obnoxious British yelped vocals I alluded to before, but they're given so much more context than I'm used to via the instrumentals. Lyrically, it's also a lot more substantive than I'm used to, and it's also a lot more technical than I anticipated, with key changes and other musical twists and turns throughout without sacrificing any speed at all. I always expected to like this record, it's why I put it on the list for these videos, but man, this is way better than I could have anticipated. I would go so far as to call it a perfect punk album. Give this one a look if you haven't yet, like I hadn't before this. So, that's another 5 records cleared off my backlog, and 5 more up on the block. This is going to get a lot more frequent now that I'm moved out, so let me know what albums you think I should listen to that I haven't rated yet using my Rate Your Music profile in the link below. If you're not sure where to look, there should be a search bar under my profile picture where you can put an artist's name and see all the albums I've listened to by them. If I haven't rated it, then chances are I've not heard it, so let me know what I'm missing. I'm also curious what you guys would think about themed episodes in the future, something like 5 essential metal albums or something like that. I would also not be opposed to doing this for different types of media in general, be it games or movies or something else. Music has always been and will always be my #1 priority, but I would love to do some minor branching off into other things I love for this channel. What do you guys think? Thanks as always to my patrons. If you want to see your name on this ever-growing list here and get the chance to talk to me and my top fans directly in a Discord server unlike any other, you can give me $3 or more on Patreon to get access. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.